Okay, so thanks for the opportunity to talk to you about something that's really, I think, bigger than what a lot of us have any idea about. And the question I would start with is, can willpower alone get us there and back? And I think as advisors, a lot of times we look at what happens if we can get more money at some point in time into the future, which is important, but do we look at it all the way through? And so I'm going to try to do that today and show you some of the pieces, some of the possibilities, and how Currence actually is the one thing that'll make it happen. And so I'm not going to try to teach software or how to do what I'm going to do, but along the way, I would encourage you to take some notes just so that you can refer back to some of the pieces and see how they fit in. We'll pull off the path periodically to do a photo op. If you want to take a picture, maybe that will help, but I think writing it down is a bigger piece. When I started this, so here's a picture of Mount Everest. So that's the summit we're going to try to climb and get back. As I started looking at the idea of Everest, if we back up, who was the first person that actually scaled Everest successfully and got back? Edmund Hillary, right? Sir Edmund Hillary now, not at the time, but Sir, after he made it, he was actually knighted, right? So let's go look at that.
On a file share.
What's that?
They'll get a picture at the end.
Yes, sorry. Kim's reminded me at the end, I will actually give you, there'll be a QR code that you can scan. It'll go to the data file that we're going to use, so you don't have to worry about trying to get that. If you want to try to reproduce what we've done, download the software and also get the PDFs, it'll be from that. So we'll do that at the end. But here's Edmund Hillary and his Sherpa, Tenzing Norgay, back in 1953 when they made it to the summit. And I know a lot of you have probably heard this famous question and answer that he's often credited with. Why climb Mount Everest? And what's the answer? Because it's there, right? He actually wasn't the first person to say it. It was actually on a British expedition that failed 30 years prior to that. And that was with George Mallory. George Mallory was the first person to say it. He was asked this question, why climb Mount Everest? And he said, because it is there. Now, George Mallory was incredibly capable, incredibly disciplined. In fact, he had climbed 5 or 6 of the majors before he did this. The Brits took him on this trip because they wanted success of being the first to get to the top. He went 3 times trying. He had all the discipline in the world, and unfortunately, he is still on the mountain. Okay? If we look at some of the differences between him and Hillary in climbing technology, what we see is in 1924, when George Mallory tried, he had wool and cotton clothing. Everything was natural fibers. And the problem with that was it caused perspiration, it caused freezing, it caused all kinds of other problems. His boots literally were leather boots with nails driven through the bottom for traction, and they used hay and grass as insulation. His communications between base camp and where he was and what was going on, they had pen and paper, and Sherpas were hauling those messages back and forth between the camps. And Mallory created actually a system of symbols with sleeping bags, with the idea he could put the sleeping bags up, turn them a certain way, cross them, and he had these different symbols where hopefully the base camp below or the telescope could see what they were and get an idea of what was going on. And that's all they had to work with at the time, right? And totally unreliable oxygen. In fact, he had like a rubber hose run into his mouth that they were trying to use. 30 pounds of oxygen tanks, steel oxygen tanks at the time, added to all the other stuff that he had to be able to haul up the mountain and try to make it. Now, we move 30 years ahead to Edmund Hillary's time. Now we've got insulated climbing suit, we've got rubber-soled boots, with insulation and actually cleats on them. We've got radios for communication, a lot bigger than what we know of now. They were a little cumbersome, but they did have radios. And reliable oxygen tanks that the Royal Air Force actually helped design from a mask standpoint and everything else. A lot of change over 30 years. And when we talk about change, and it's been mentioned several times from the stage, change doesn't happen linearly, right? It's exponential. It moves, technology moves exponentially. It's not in a straight line. The more we learn, the more we can learn, right? And I love this quote from Gretchen Rubin. The days pass slowly, but the years fly by. What does that mean? You know, we're living in the moment, and we look at a day and we see that it's a long time. But once we go forward a little bit, we can look back and say, man, 10 years have gone by, 5 years have gone by, 30 years have gone by, whatever that time frame is. So the years fly by, but the moment that we're living in seems to go pretty slowly. The impact of that is in a lot of different areas, savings being one of those areas. So if we look at savings and we think about savings, when we're looking at it and we think things are going slow, we look at the amount of money that we can put away and do without, but we can't see the picture of what happens when those years fly by. It's hard at the time, so we lose focus of what impact that's going to have over time, and it's all about how hard it is to do now, or how long it takes to do now. Even a bigger problem, I think, is from the standpoint of cost. People have no idea what's going to happen over time. Lucian mentioned some of this just a few minutes ago. It's a difficult thing for people to wrap their head around. If we look at a 35-year time frame on a 35-year-old, so from 35 out to 69, and we start with an $86,000 expense, and we take it out over that 35 years, at a 4% inflation rate, it is 4 times as much money, just short of 4 times as much money, $326,311, right? How can anybody see that? How can you think about this? I'm spending everything I have now. I've got $86,000 in expenses, and somehow it's supposed to be $326,000 35 years ago? No way, right? Now, we can look back and we can see that over the last 30 years, it's gone up at that rate, but it's just hard to look out there in the future and have the idea that it's going to continue on that process. But if we get out to age 70, did we get all the way out there? Is that really what that cost is that we're going to have to overcome looks like? What about during the distribution phase? What about when we turn that around? What if we go another 35 years? Look what that does. It takes $1,287,000 to do what $86,000 does today, if inflation is in fact only 4% across that time frame. So what we have to actually set our clients up to be able to do is provide that last 35 or last 50 or whatever that time frame is on all of those increases over that time. And they're going up exponentially, not linearly. And so when we look at this, that's 15 times what it is today. Now, I'm not saying that you need to get all of this across to your client, but what I want you to do is think about this from the standpoint of how can I help my client? What can I see in these numbers so that, as Vince said earlier, we don't have to share these numbers with the clients, but we have to be solid in what we know we can do and what this is going to look like in our client's life. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, so let's push forward. And I'm going to put a fairly simple case together. I'm going to give you all the facts on the case. I'm going to make a simple wealth shift, and then I'm going to also show here what those shifts are going to be. So you may want to write these down. And I'm going to do it all before I do the case, just so you'll have that information. But I'm going to take a 35-year-old couple, each earning $100,000 a year, so a total of $200,000 a year. $500,000 on their personal residence they've had for a year. So they got the residence, they got a mortgage of $400,000 a year ago, which is now $380,000 at 4.5%. And they've got 168 months left because it was a 15-year mortgage. So their payment's $3,060 a month. $75,000 in an equity portfolio, adding $17,000 a year. And they've got a 60-40 split between the equities and the bonds. The equities at 8%, the bonds at 4%. $43,000 a year of fixed expenses. So those things they can't do anything about. They're going to follow inflation. They're stuck there, from food to electric bill, water bill, all those things that we can't do without. We can't decide over that. Those are our fixed expenses. And another $43,000 that are more discretionary. Trips that we want to make, going out to eat, those kind of things, right? So that's that total of $86,000 that we looked at a minute ago. And then they've got a bunch of revolving debt. They've got $55,000 in revolving credit card debt at various interest rates. So there's one $25,000 balance at 18%, $394 a month payment for 204 months. They've got a $15,000 balance at 14%, $200 a month, the minimum payment that they're paying over 180 months. That's how long it'll take to pay it off. $7,500 balance at 16%, $100 a month, 204 months paid off, and $8,000 at 19.4 for $134 a month payment. Okay? What's that? So photo time for anybody that needs to get that base information. The information will be inside of there, and yes, you also have the PDF of the PowerPoint, so if you want to play with it. But I think just knowing this as we go into the next phase will be helpful for you, so you can keep track of what we're doing here in just a minute as we throw a bunch of numbers at you, right? Okay, so now what I want to talk about is what we chose to do to help the client move forward. So here's the case facts. These are the wealth shifts. So this is what we did. We decided to refinance the mortgage and do a cash out of $55,000. Now what's interesting is it actually lowered our mortgage payment by $307 a month, even though we had to go to a 6.5% interest rate. They were paying 4.5%. We moved them to 6.5% because unfortunately that's all we have as access right now. But by stretching it out to 360 months, it actually freed up $307 worth of cash flow. All right? We decided to pay off the revolving debt, that $55,000, with the cash out that we took from the mortgage, and that freed up another $835 a month. So we've got roughly a little over $13,000 a month that we a year that we freed up through refining that credit card debt with a slightly larger mortgage. Okay? In the process, we're able to take that little over $13,000, $6,856 apiece in premium, by $260,000 on him and her. Now, because of an increase in income that we're going to have over the time frame, creating a delta between increased expenses and increased income, we'll be able to buy another $18,000 of premium at age 45, so $9,000 a piece then on each one of them, so another $225,000 policy at age 45. With me so far? Okay. All right. Then what we're going to look at is the impact of Currence. First, shifting unconscious spending into unconscious savings. And then we're going to use Currence to help us do some conscious shifting into some conscious savings. Okay? Pull over for a photo op.
You want to elaborate on that last one a little bit more?
Yeah, so and what I mean on that last one is what happens if inflation is running along at 4%, we're used to on our fixed expenses of, and we really don't have a choice there, right? We've got to increase those with inflation. But what about on our discretionary side? What if the $43,000 of discretionary expenses, we decide we're going to actively reduce the rate of increase on those? So that's an interesting thing. What are most of your clients concerned about when they relent to setting up a meeting with you?
It'll cost them something.
Right. It's going to cost them money, right? They're going to have to do without. They're going to have to reduce their lifestyle. All we're talking about here is slowing the increase in lifestyle. We're still increasing lifestyle every year, but we're going to slow the discretionary side from keeping up with inflation at 4% to just trimming it to where we're only increasing each year by 3%. So we're not knocking anything off today. We're just slowing the rate of increase over time by 1 percentage point, right? Okay, so let's see. If you'll go forward, well, that's fine. So here is our case file. So go, if you would, Kim, to the summary. So when we look at the summary, we see this column. Let's see this. This is magic technology from Vince. All right, so we have these last 3 columns here, and I'm going to look in the third from the left, and this is the amount of money after our income taxes, mortgage, and investments. This column here, the second from the right, is those expenses, the $86,000 a year, and on the far right is what's left over. Now, where does this show up? Yeah. Nowhere, right? Why? Why? No. Think about George Mallory for a minute.
Cheap shoes with nails?
No. His famous answer. Because it's there, right? That, because it is there, because it's sitting in his expense account, it doesn't exist, right? And so, Kim, if you'd turn on just add it to the expenses. So why they know what their expenses are, and when you ask them what their expenses are and they'll give you some idea, the reality is it's that plus this increasing amount that happens every year because it doesn't show up anywhere. Do you ever have clients that have more money in their accounts than what they said was after their expenses? No, it just gets consumed, right? And there is always going to be that delta between income and an increase in expenses. Why? Because the income expense increase, or the income increase, is happening on a larger amount of money than what the expenses are. So it's going to create a wider gap over that time frame, and yet it doesn't end up in anybody's pocket, right? It just ends up getting spent. Okay, so what if, and actually, Kim, if you would, let's look at the resource sheet. So we have a resource identification sheet, and in here, whoops, I pushed your slide forward. Inside of here, what we can see is our mutual funds, $75,000 that we've got sitting in there. We're adding $17,000 a year. And we see a current rate of 6.4. I thought we were earning 8% in our mutual funds. But remember, it was a 60-40 split between equities at 8 and bonds at 4. And the result is we're getting 6.4% in there. So that 4% bond anchor is actually pulling our 8% down quite a bit. We can see that we could pull the interest off of that account. $4,500 a year would be the interest. or we could do a pay down on that account, and at over 20 years, it would be $6,300. Those are some options. What we chose to do, that's their only investments, only savings. We chose to leave those alone. But here on this next line, we can see their current mortgage of $380,000 at 4.5%. If we stretch that to $360,000, that would free up $13,000. But we didn't do that either. What we did was we refied the mortgage into $435,000, and you can do that.
I need you to move your fancy toy.
So there's our $435,000. Do we get to do it at 4.5% since we're refining into current rates? No, we have to do that at 6.5%, right? All right, and so what we see down here is, again, about $300 a month, a little over $300 a month that we talked about a minute ago. So this just shows us what we're capable, what we have available from cash flow to redirect, to do a shift. And again, we chose to leave the equity portfolio alone, and we're just keeping it simple and adjusting the debt. Now, since I moved that $435,000, I changed my mortgage to that, even though I only own $380,000. That gives me the $55,000 to pay off the consumer debt, right? The credit card debt. Any questions on where we are so far?
What's that calculator called?
Asset flow.
Asset flow.
Asset flow, yep. It's a large calculator. Basically everything, all your income, everything goes in, and it'll, and all your investments, and it'll keep up with all your expenses, all of it. Okay? Now, so I'm going to look at the results of that. So if we go to the results, what we see is, and actually, Kim, I think what I'll have you do is just let's look at it in graphical format. No, push that back if you would, and go to compare. And let's just look at those two options side by side, 0 and 1. Okay, are we better off in what we've suggested? Yeah. Right? Yeah, so this blue on this line is the amount of money accumulating over time, and it uses this right-hand scale. The orange is their existing plan, and then down across the bottom we see the cash flows that are going on over that time frame. So in doing what we're talking about doing, we actually added about $2 million out there to the end. And if we can see that we're a little behind on the front end, right, in the early days. But what about from a death benefit standpoint? And do we care what the cash is in the early phase? If we look at a death benefit, then this is what we have. So we're ahead all the way through. So now we've taken care of the family. We end up with more cash at the end, and certainly along the way. The question, though, going back to my initial question is, does that solve the problem? So there is some debate. Go back to George Mallory for a minute. When George made his last trip, they actually found him in 1999. And they don't know for sure if he made it and didn't make it back. They've been trying to find his camera to find out, did they actually make it to the summit and disaster struck on the way back, or did they never get there in the first place? And the climbing society overall has decided it doesn't really matter. He still is not the first person to make a successful trip, right? Because he didn't get back. He didn't make it home. All right? So we need to see what that looks like on the back side to see if all we did was make them better or did we solve a problem. Does that make sense? And I think because it's difficult to show that a lot of times, and maybe we're even afraid of what that looks like on the backside, we don't do it. Most everything during the accumulation phase comes into this idea of, let's see how much money we can pile up. And yet, we all know what's more important, net worth or cash flow when we get into the distribution phase. And how many of us are really talking about the cash flow during that phase, right?
Do you want to look at the mutual fund difference?
Yeah. One of the other things that happens that's really cool on what we just did, or it is to me anyway, let's look at asset flow 0, all right, and let's look at the mutual funds. And what we see down here at the bottom is about $3 million accumulated over that time frame. Okay, that's the $75,000 in, adding $17,000 a year. Now, did we do anything with the mutual funds in our solution or our first wealth shift? No. What if we understood that cash value was similar in a lot of ways to bonds? And we use that value of the cash value as part of the rebalancing when we decide what portion in that 60-40 is bonds and what portion of it's equities.
Say that again?
What if we use the cash value asset as part of the bond portion when we decide each year when we rebalance the account into our 60-40 split? What could that do? Well, let's look at asset flow 1, our change, and look at the mutual funds. Which one are you on?
I'm on 1, but the number's not what we want. So
Something's not right. What was the first one? Was
3. We're looking for 3.5. It's there, Todd. Some of it, it's on my screen.
is it on yours up there?
Yeah, 3.5.
No, up there. How funny. What's that?
Right at the bottom.
Oh, it wasn't. Sorry, it wasn't on mine yet. Mine was behind. Okay, so there's $3.5 million. So that's kind of interesting, isn't it? We bought life insurance. We didn't do anything with the mutual funds. And the fact that we have the cash value and we're applying that into the overall picture, we actually added $500,000 to the portfolio just because we weren't shifting as much of that 8% money to 4% money. Does that make sense? A massive difference. So let's do what we were talking about, and let's go out into the future. Let's see what this looks like when we actually look at the distribution phase. So Kim, if you'll change both of these to just make them 120, and then let's look at the compare. While she's doing that, while she's bringing it up, just something to note, kind of a side thing that I think is kind of important. I learned some stuff recently about credit score improvement. Those credit cards that we paid off with the $55,000 and are now at 0, yes, it may be a good idea for the clients to cut them up or whatever else, but we don't want to close those accounts. And the reason is 35% of your credit score comes from revolving debt. So whatever your revolving debt is, the good or bad there is going to impact your credit score by 35%. It doesn't matter if there's 1 credit card in there, or there's 4 credit cards in there, or there's 10 credit cards in there. That lump sum is going to have a 35% impact on your overall score. So the more we have in there could be beneficial to weigh down the problem ones we have. The other issue there is that a big part of the score comes down to credit history. If we've had those credit cards for a long time and we cancel them and start a new one, we've just taken all that time off our credit history, and it's going to impair our credit score. So we might want to keep those cards at a zero balance to keep the credit history, even though we've paid them off. Okay, so, and Kim, let's shorten the time frame just so it's easy. We're just going to look at the distribution time, so if you would just change that to 70 and 120. Oh, sorry. I like my toy, though.
I'm well aware of that. Do you want unvalued errors or net worth?
It's fine. So what we see now is this is during that 70 to 120, and what we can see is we did extend their income by, what is that, 7 years as far as keeping up with inflation, right? So they continue their same level of lifestyle. Let me ask you something. How many of your clients say, we can't wait to retire so that we can stop doing stuff? Right? Is that what they say? Or do they say, we're looking at retirement, and when we get there, we're going to start taking trips, and we're going to start doing all these things. So they're talking about doing more than what their lifestyle is at the end of this time frame. And everybody else is talking about how we're going to have to cut back. So if we kept just their existing lifestyle, so we're not talking about adding travel and those kind of things here, what we see is it gets us out to now, where? 96. For some, that might be enough. For me, that's thinking way short. Why? We've been talking about exponential curves a little bit. What about the exponential curve on mortality? Why is that moving forward at the rate that it's moving? Technology, right? Technology is a big part of that piece. What's happening medically from the standpoint of technology? Is that going to stop, or is it going to continue? How long are we going to live? Who knows, right? But it has moved quite a bit in a short period of time. What was life expectancy like 30 years ago? What's it going to be like in another 30 with it moving at an exponential rate? So while that's better, did it solve the problem? Because eventually they're going to drop down to just Social Security, and that's what we're seeing from that point on. We can see that on the blue line on ours, we actually have a little bit more than Social Security. Why? Because we're actually making some distributions from our life insurance policy. So we are better than their scenario. But I would say we haven't solved the problem. We've just made it better or less bad, however you want to look at it, right? So what could we do to fix that other side?
Do you want to look at the single chart first with expenses?
Sure. That would be helpful, actually. So here's just the expenses, and I mean just the income, and let's look at the expenses if you'd add those in there. So here's what happens on the expenses. If we kept up with inflation, this red block right here is what expenses should be. And we held on until 96, and then we dropped down to Social Security, and we're significantly less across that time frame. What could we do? Could we go back and maybe pull some of the money off the mutual funds? Probably is not going to help the situation, right? Actually, we've improved what's going on with mutual funds just by having the life insurance be part of that rebalance fund instead of having to rely on the bonds all the way through. What about Currence? Could Currence change any of this? Let's see. So let's go to asset flow 2. All right, so, and go to the summary. If you can remember at the beginning of when we started this, remember this column over here? The excess above and beyond what our expenses were that just gets blown. Why does it get blown? Because it's there. What if we had something in place that kept it from being there? What if we shift that over to just to keep everything simple right now, we're just going to take that and put it in a 4% taxable account. Okay? When we do that, let's look at what our comparison looks like. And add another one in there, so you'll have to go back to the spreadsheet. Yep. And we're going to make this one purple, so on the purple one, put the 2 in there. And let's look at it.
Back to the big chart.
Yeah. Something missing in that one. Have it restructure it. Click on the chart again. No. Well. There you go. All right. So what we can see is what Currence did was push this line up so that we ended up starting during the distribution phase with a good $500,000 more money than what our original solution was. Now, at this point right here, it gets to be the same. Why? Because we've consumed all the asset. And when we look at what happened with their current plan, actually right here, when they stop being able to keep up, they have depleted their mutual funds. All the money's gone. And, you know, if we look at this, wow, their $6 million are going to pass, but what is that $6 million? It's their house. Let me ask you this. If they have had to drop to Social Security, how likely is it that they've been maintaining that house at full value? It probably isn't going to be worth $6 million, is it? If we add Currence, now then what's happened here? We've added 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 more years before we have to drop to Social Security. That gets them out to 103. That's a lot better, yeah? So at that point, we have turned unconscious spending into unconscious savings. And we've extended another 8 years and still given, you know, from a legacy standpoint, the house and the life insurance, we've got just short of $10 million out there. What if we got excited about the fact that, thinking about the days being long and the years being flying by, what if after a couple of years of seeing the impact that Currence can have, that there's savings in my account that somebody must have put there because there's no way that I did that by myself. And if I did, you know what? I like seeing the savings. I like seeing how it's happening. What if we took an active role in reducing our discretionary expense increase? Not our discretionary expenses, but the rate of increase on those discretionary expenses. So let's go to the last, or actually you can just add it in here.
To the expenses.
No, just go to the chart. To the spreadsheet and add number 3 as green. And let's look at it. And yeah, redo it. Nope. Yep. All right. So what we see here is, here's our green. It runs all the way out to 120, but it's less than what the expenses are. Why? Because the expenses are shown here going up at 4%, but we were committed to reducing our rate of increase on our expenses to 3, right? Change that to C up there. This is where our expenses are. Holy cow. We pulled money all the way out to 120 and kept up with what we decided was going to be our increase over this time frame. So we have maintained our standard of living all the way out to 120. What did it do to us from the standpoint of asset value, what we're going to pass as a legacy? And we pass just short of $13 million. That's the power of what Currence can do to make the difference. Our wealth shifts and things did part of it, But that's why Currence is one of the most exciting things I've seen in the industry in a long time, because it will actually make this happen. And I think a lot of us are kind of afraid to show that back end, because even when we make improvements for our clients, did we actually solve the problem? Now we have the ability to actually solve the problem, right? And, Lucian mentioned it earlier. What would it take to duplicate this elsewhere? 30, 40% of our income is what we would have to be dedicated to doing? Can anybody really do that even if they wanted to? I don't think so. Okay? Back. Okay, results. So what did we accomplish in all this? We paid off the credit card debt, which improved their credit score, and added an emergency opportunity fund that might keep them from being back in that spot. Why? Because we have cash now, we've got access to cash. We added $260,000 each in death benefit now. That's going to grow to $885,000 by age 70 and provide $43,000 a year each of net after-tax income from 90 on. We added the ability to buy another $225,000 of face amount each at age 45, which was another $18,000 of premium, $9,000 each. That's going to also provide $28,000 a year of tax-free income from 90 plus. We improved the efficiency of the market portfolio by providing cash value as part of that rebalance on the bonds, so that we added almost $500,000 worth of assets to the equity account. This is, if you can understand this piece, this is huge right here. Whoops. We shifted the spending habits, and it's pretty easy to see. When we reduce the spending habits, we think about it on the front end. If we can reduce our cost, is that going to give us more money in savings to have a bigger pile of money by the time we get to the distribution phase? Yeah, only if we have some way of getting it there, right? Only if we have something like Currence that's going to hold on to it, because discipline is going to be a hard way to get there. Remember George Mallory? He tried to do it all on discipline, right? Without the tech. But equally important is once we make that switch and we start on the spending side of that, when we start on the distribution side, now not only did it allow us to build more during the accumulation, but when we switch to distribution, we're pulling out $290,000 a year at that point, rather than $339,000 if we had kept our expenses growing at 4%. And this goes back to the question I asked earlier. How many people say we want to stop doing stuff when we retire? Nobody. That means you're going to have to be spending at least what that was when you start the distribution phase as what it was when you finished the accumulation phase, right? It allowed for continued lifestyle through age 120, plus a $12 million legacy, versus running out of money at age 89 and forced to live on Social Security and passing only the house that, again, probably is not going to be worth the $6 million that we're looking at here. And something I don't have on here, what about sequencing of returns as we start the distribution from our mutual funds? How do we handle that? We've created a cash flow bridge with life insurance cash value that allows us to only have to pull money out of the market when it's an ideal time to pull money out of the market. So we've got something in place now that is going to make that distribution phase actually work at the most efficient way possible, versus being forced to pull when the market's down or some other time when it's not the best time to pull it. Okay, back through on technology. So in the 1920s, during George Mallory's time, this is what a telephone looked like. We forward ahead to Hillary's time, and we had those 20-pound telephones that they probably could have thrown off of the top of Mount Everest and it would still survive. And where are we today? We've moved to this. Technology has moved us to a place where we can have all this information directly on our phone to be that last scenario that we looked at rather than the first one, or even the second one or third one, right? Go on to the next one. Okay, so here's a QR code that'll take you where you can download the latest version of the software. It will install a data file that's the data of what we had in here, as well as an option to look at the PDF. And while you're doing that, so
15 minutes.
oh,
Good time.
we have a choice on the technology. And just a fact, again, on Mount Everest, there are, I don't know, they call themselves purists, I guess. 45% of the people that have tried that are still on the mountain. That is not a very good statistic. Okay? There are some that made it. 55% of the people that attempted it without oxygen were actually successful. I'm not telling you your clients can't do it without Currence. I'm just saying there's going to be a lot of them that are going to be left on the mountain if they try. What's the point? We really need to be the Tenzing Norgay Sherpas of the financial world. We need to bring all of the latest technology to help our clients so that we get them not just to the summit, not just to the distribution start, but all the way back home. And the only way we're going to do that is by really having a compelling story to get our clients to go down the path of Currence. That's it.